They say a prison is shaped by the men it holds. And if that's true, then San Quentin, California's oldest and most notorious prison, carries the weight of some of the darkest souls in American history. When you walk past its cold concrete walls, you're not just hearing the echoes of chains or steel doors closing. You're hearing stories. Stories of men who terrified entire cities and then terrified the inmates locked inside with them. Today, we're pulling back the curtain. Welcome to the place where some of the most feared prisoners in America lived, ruled, and took their final breaths. This is San Quentin, and these are its most dangerous legends. Before we go deeper, hit subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Richard Ramirez. The Night Stalker. When Richard Ramirez entered San Quentin, a silence fell over the prison unlike anything the guards had seen in years. It wasn't the silence of fear alone, it was the silence of recognition. Everyone knew who he was. Ramirez didn't walk in like a broken man. He walked in like a celebrity entering an award show. Chin high, eyes dark, soaking in the attention. To the outside world, he was the monster who had terrorized California for months. To inmates, he was something more dangerous, unpredictable. His reputation entered the prison before he did. Stories spread, some true, some exaggerated. But one thing was clear, nobody wanted to be on his bad side. Ramirez never needed to raise his voice. He didn't need to fight. His presence alone carried a chill. San Quentin guards monitored him closely from day one. They noticed something unsettling. He had fans. Letters poured in. Photographs. Marriage proposals. It angered other inmates and confused prison staff. Ramirez would often sit alone in the yard, staring at the sky like he was looking for something that wasn't there. But that calm look only made him more frightening. A killer who doesn't show anger. That's the kind of man inmates avoid. He wasn't physically imposing, but influence inside prisons comes from one thing: fear. And Ramirez had that without trying. Some inmates claimed they heard him whisper to himself at night. Others said he never slept. Guards said he had an aura, as if darkness followed him down every hall. Ramirez never ran the yard. He didn't need to. He existed in his own space, like a shadow sitting in sunlight. His time in San Quentin ended in 2013 when he died of health complications. But even after his death, inmates said the prison felt different, like a storm had finally passed. Ramirez wasn't just feared for what he'd done. He was feared because he seemed to enjoy the legend built around him. San Quentin had seen killers before, but none like the Night Stalker. Charles Manson, the cult leader who controlled from a cell. San Quentin has held violent men, ruthless men, broken men. But very few inmates could influence people without ever touching them. Charles Manson was one of those rare, terrifying exceptions. When he arrived, his reputation already wrapped around the prison like fog. He wasn't a giant. He wasn't muscular. And yet he managed to scare both inmates and guards for one reason: he could control minds. Manson didn't have loyal gang protection in San Quentin. What he had was something far more dangerous: charisma twisted into something dark. Other inmates watched him closely, some out of fear, others out of curiosity. A few even listened to him, hoping to understand why people outside had been drawn into his world. Guards reported that Manson had a strange calmness. Even when he smiled, it felt like a warning. He made cryptic comments. He hummed songs to himself. He stared longer than necessary. It was small things like that which made him so unsettling. One officer described him as a man who could make the air feel colder just by talking. Inmates who had spent their whole lives around violence still refused to sit near him in the chow hall. Not because he was physically dangerous, but because Manson made people uneasy in ways fists and knives never could. To many, he was a symbol, proof that danger doesn't always come with size or strength. Sometimes danger is delivered in whispers, in ideas, in the belief that you can convince others to do anything. Manson died in 2017, but the stories remain. San Quentin changed many men, but some men, like Manson, changed the room they were in simply by being there. David Carpenter, the trailside killer. If Ramirez brought fear and Manson brought unease, then David Carpenter brought something much colder to San Quentin: calculation. Carpenter wasn't loud. He wasn't dramatic. He wasn't trying to make a name for himself. He had already done that long before he stepped into the prison. When inmates talked about him, they didn't raise their voices. They lowered them. Carpenter looked like someone's quiet uncle. Glasses, calm expression, but everyone knew the truth. Behind that harmless face was a man responsible for one of California's most chilling crime sprees. Guards described him as robotic. Inmates called him the man without emotion. He walked the prison halls as if he wasn't there. No anger, no fear, just a blankness. It was that emptiness that made him so frightening. Many inmates are violent because of impulse, some because of rage, some because of upbringing. But Carpenter? His violence had been planned, calculated, step by step. He didn't look like a threat, which made him even more of one. In the yard, men kept their distance. The toughest inmates, the ones who ruled their cell blocks, walked around him like he was a hole in the ground. Even officers said he had an unsettling habit of staring at people without blinking. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't intimidation. It was studying. Carpenter is still alive in San Quentin today, older now, but still carrying the same chilling calmness he arrived with. In a place filled with men who acted on chaos, he represented the opposite, order twisted into something deadly. Clarence Ray Allen, the man who never stopped being dangerous. Danger in San Quentin usually comes from young men, strong, fast, unpredictable. Clarence Ray Allen didn't fit that picture at all. When he arrived on death row, he was already older. When he faced execution years later, he was in a wheelchair, blind in one eye, and hooked to medical equipment. And yet, ask any guard from his era who they feared most, and his name would come up. Allen was different from the others for one terrifying reason. His reach extended far beyond his own cell. Even behind bars, he managed to plan and order violent acts. He had the ability to influence people outside the prison, something extremely rare and incredibly dangerous. Guards treated him with extreme caution, not because he could overpower them physically, but because he had proven he could cause harm without ever leaving his bed. He didn't shout. He didn't fight. He didn't threaten. He simply planned. Inside San Quentin, rumors about him spread rapidly. Inmates whispered that he had long arms, meaning his influence stretched far. Others said he could get things done with a single phone call. Whether all of it was true or not didn't matter. In prison, perception is power, and Allen had plenty of it. When he was finally executed in 2006 at the age of 76, he became one of the oldest inmates ever put to death in California. His story left behind a strange truth. Violence isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's patient. And sometimes it comes from a man who looks too old to stand. These four men, each feared for different reasons, left a permanent mark on San Quentin. Ramirez brought darkness. Manson brought control. Carpenter brought calculation. Allen brought influence. Together, their presence reshaped the reputation of a prison already known for its harsh history. Guards who worked through those years said there was a weight in the air, like the building itself was holding its breath. Inmates remember the tension, the quiet, the way certain names could shut down an entire conversation. San Quentin wasn't just a prison during their time there. It was a storm waiting to break. San Quentin's walls have witnessed decades of violence, desperation, and terror. They have absorbed the fear of men who walked their corridors with a reputation so dark, even hardened inmates dared not cross them. By the time the Night Stalker, Charles Manson, David Carpenter, and Clarence Ray Allen left their mark, the prison had transformed. But the shadow of fear never left. It simply found new hosts. Now, let us discuss the stories of the men who followed in their footsteps, men whose names alone could silence a yard, whose presence demanded respect, and whose actions reminded everyone that in San Quentin, survival wasn't just about strength. It was about reputation. Before we go any further, hit subscribe if you haven't already, so you can follow these chilling stories as they unfold. The rise of the modern legends. Not all feared inmates earned that title through sheer violence. Some ruled through intelligence, influence, or sheer unpredictability. These were the prisoners who understood the power of presence. Take Herman Wallace, for example. Part of the infamous Angola 3, Wallace spent decades in solitary confinement, his mind sharpened by isolation. When he arrived in San Quentin for a brief transfer, guards and inmates alike noticed the quiet intensity in his eyes. He spoke little, but every word carried weight. His story, a man who had survived extreme isolation and emerged unbroken, inspired awe and fear. Wallace's presence reminded everyone that confinement did not always break a spirit. In some cases, it forged one sharper than any knife. The shadow of George Ringo Rodriguez. Next came George Ringo Rodriguez, a man who had built his reputation on unpredictability and cunning. Unlike other inmates, Rodriguez rarely fought outright. He didn't need to. What made him feared was the uncertainty he carried. Guards never knew how he would act. Fellow inmates never knew when he might strike. That uncertainty created an invisible wall around him. Rodriguez mastered the art of psychological dominance. He understood that fear wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet, subtle, and patient. His ability to manipulate situations without raising his voice made him a living example of a principle long understood in San Quentin: reputation is power. San Quentin is home to California's death row, a place where tension isn't just in the air. It saturates the concrete walls, echoing through every cell block. Here, fear becomes routine. Each inmate knows that their neighbor might be a killer, and yet, each also knows that the system treats them as disposable. Death row is a world apart. Guards move with extreme caution. Prisoners walk with quiet pride. Even minor slights can trigger explosive consequences. One inmate described it as living in a house where every shadow could be a threat, and every word could be the last you speak aloud. It's not just physical danger. It's mental. The constant awareness that death is an ever-present visitor changes everything. Inmates develop habits, routines, and codes to survive. It's a place where fear is both armor and weapon. San Quentin, like all prisons, operates on unspoken rules. Violating these rules can mean a beating, a life of isolation, or worse. Among the most feared inmates, there exists a hierarchy of respect. It isn't always based on size or strength, but on the combination of past crimes, cunning, and the ability to instill fear without constant violence. Inmates like Ringo Rodriguez and Herman Wallace demonstrated this. They understood that controlling the yard didn't always mean throwing punches. Sometimes, it meant commanding silence with a glance, earning obedience with presence alone. Others, however, relied on outright brutality. Men who had no other option, who survived through sheer force, left a different type of mark, one that made every prison story told in whispers. It was this combination, intellect, violence, and unpredictability, that made San Quentin's most feared men legends. Interestingly, the influence of these inmates wasn't confined to the yard. Their reputations reached beyond the bars, shaping how the prison operated. Guards adapted routines, security measures were tightened, and policies shifted based on lessons learned from their behavior. For example, the unpredictable violence of some prisoners forced administrators to rethink cell placement, isolation measures, and even exercise schedules. The presence of mentally unstable yet highly dangerous inmates like David Carpenter and the calm menace of Clarence Ray Allen became case studies in prison management. Their existence reshaped San Quentin not just socially, but institutionally. The legacy of fear. Each of these men, from the Night Stalker to Ringo Rodriguez, from Herman Wallace to Clarence Ray Allen, left a legacy. It's a paradoxical one. They were all criminals, some killers, some manipulative, some both. Yet their stories also highlight a truth about San Quentin: fear is currency. Inmates survive, guards endure, and the prison adapts. San Quentin doesn't just house criminals. It houses power in many forms: strength, intellect, unpredictability, and most importantly, fear. Even today, new inmates arrive and are told the stories of these men. They hear about Ramirez's shadow, Manson's influence, Carpenter's cold calculation, Allen's extended reach, and Rodriguez's unpredictability. The lesson is simple, yet terrifying. In San Quentin, reputation is survival, and fear is respect. The psychology of terror. Psychologists have studied prisons like San Quentin for decades, trying to understand why certain inmates instill fear beyond their physical capabilities. The answer isn't just violence. It's unpredictability, presence, and the ability to manipulate perception. Men like Manson or Carpenter demonstrated that a killer doesn't need to strike to dominate. His aura, his mind, and his reputation can terrify even the toughest men. San Quentin became a laboratory of fear, a place where the most dangerous human traits were amplified by confinement, isolation, and the pressure cooker environment of the prison system. Even guards acknowledged it. Some admitted they approached certain cells with caution, not because the inmate had weapons, but because the inmate carried a storm in his mind. San Quentin continues to operate today, housing hundreds of men who are dangerous, unpredictable, and often violent. Yet, the legends of the past cast long shadows. The stories of fear, respect, and survival are passed down from one generation of inmates to the next, creating a culture that is both brutal and fascinating. In the end, the prison is more than its walls and bars. It is the men who live inside it, the stories they tell, the fear they inspire, and the legacy they leave behind. From the Night Stalker to Clarence Ray Allen, from the calculated calm of David Carpenter to the subtle dominance of Ringo Rodriguez, these men were more than criminals. They were legends. They were lessons in fear. And for everyone who walked San Quentin's halls, their presence was impossible to ignore. As the gates close each night, the echoes of their lives ripple through the cell blocks. San Quentin isn't just a prison. It's a monument to human darkness, endurance, and the terrifying power of reputation. This is Crime Source. Subscribe for more videos.